Your great-grandparents survived without grocery stores, without Amazon, without a single app on their phone. And they did it better than most people could today, not because life was simpler, because they knew things we threw away. Drop a comment right now, tell me what state you're watching from, hit subscribe and share this with one person who needs to wake up. Let's go. 11. Depending on only one food source. Here's the first mistake that would get you killed, and almost everyone is making it right now. Old farmers never not once bet everything on a single crop. Walk through any traditional farm from 100 years ago and you'd find corn growing tall in one section, beans climbing alongside it, squash spreading low across the ground, herbs tucked into every available corner. It wasn't a garden. It was a survival system, carefully layered so that no single failure could take down the whole operation. They called combinations like corn, beans, and squash the three sisters. Indigenous and traditional farmers across the world refined this method over thousands of years, and research indicates that polyculture systems like this consistently outperform single-crop plots in long-term food security, especially under stress conditions like drought, blight, or pest pressure. The logic is brutally simple. If the corn got hit by a late frost, the beans still produced. If the beans failed, the squash fed the family. Diversity wasn't a preference, it was insurance written into the soil itself. Today, most households depend on one grocery store, one delivery service, and 3 or 4 foods that show up in every single meal. Studies suggest that the average American home has less than 2 weeks of food supply on hand. 2 weeks. Old farmers would have found that number terrifying. They didn't diversify because they were cautious by nature. They diversified because they'd watched what happened to families that didn't. 10. Wasting animal fat. This one will make you rethink everything you've ever thrown down the drain after cooking bacon. When old farmers slaughtered an animal, nothing, and I mean nothing, was discarded casually. The fat was considered one of the most valuable substances on the entire farm. Rendered down into tallow or lard, it became cooking fuel that lasted for months without refrigeration. It became candles that lit homes through long winters. It became soap that kept families clean and disease at bay. It became a protective coating rubbed into leather, wood handles, and cast iron to prevent rot and rust. In some traditions, it was even used medicinally, applied to cracked skin, chapped lips, and chest congestion. Research indicates that animal fats like tallow contain fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K, informs that the human body absorbs with exceptional efficiency. Traditional communities that consumed these fats regularly showed notably different patterns of nutritional health than communities that replaced them with industrial seed oils. But beyond nutrition, the survival function of saved fat was enormous. A household that had carefully rendered and stored its fat going into winter had light, had heat for cooking, had soap, and had the ability to preserve tools and equipment. A household that threw it away had none of those things. Today we pour it down the sink without a second thought. Old farmers would have looked at that and seen a small tragedy happening in slow motion. 9. Ignoring soil health. The land doesn't lie, and old farmers knew how to listen to it. Before synthetic fertilizers existed, before chemical inputs of any kind, traditional farmers maintained extraordinarily productive soil for generations using one core practice. They worked with the biology already living in the ground. They rotated crops systematically, moving heavy feeders like corn to a new section each year, following it with nitrogen-fixing legumes that replenished what the corn had taken. They composted kitchen waste and returned it to the beds. They spread animal manure not as a chore but as an investment, understanding that what went into the soil today was the harvest they'd eat next year. Studies suggest that soil managed with traditional organic inputs maintains measurably higher microbial diversity and biological activity than soil treated with synthetic fertilizers over the same period. And it's that biological activity, the bacteria, the fungi, the earthworms, the invisible underground ecosystem, that makes food grow with real nutritional density. When you plant the same crop in the same ground year after year with no rotation and no replenishment, you aren't farming, you're mining. You're withdrawing from an account without ever making a deposit, and like any account, eventually it hits zero. Old farmers understood that the soil was not a medium. It was a living partner. Treat it right and it would feed you indefinitely. Abuse it and it would go silent. The ground is still trying to tell us that. Most people just stopped listening. 8. Not storing seeds. What if I told you that the most powerful act of self-reliance you could perform costs almost nothing, and almost no one is doing it? Old farmers save seeds the way we save passwords today, carefully, deliberately, with the full understanding that losing them meant losing everything. At the end of every growing season, the best plants, the ones that produced the most, survived the hardest conditions, resisted disease most effectively, were marked. Their seeds were harvested, cleaned, dried slowly, and stored in cool, dry containers, sometimes labeled with small handwritten notes about the conditions of the year they were saved in. This practice did something extraordinary over time. Each season, the seeds that were saved were the seeds of the survivors. Generation by generation, those plants were being quietly adapted to that specific land, that specific climate, those specific pressures. They became something no seed catalog could ever sell, a variety shaped by and for that exact place. Research indicates that landrace seeds, varieties developed through generations of farmer selection, often demonstrate significantly stronger resilience to local climate variation than commercially developed hybrid or GMO varieties bred for industrial uniformity. Today, most gardeners and small farmers buy new seeds every year from companies who own the genetics, who can change the price, discontinue the variety, or go out of business entirely. Old farmers owned their seeds. That meant they owned their future. The moment you hand that ownership to someone else, you've made yourself dependent in the most fundamental way possible. 7. Leaving tools outside. This one sounds small, it isn't. On an old farm, tools were not just objects, they were survival assets, some of them irreplaceable, most of them expensive, all of them essential. A good scythe blade, a well-balanced axe. A set of hand cultivators, these were often the result of months of saved income or careful trade, and they were treated accordingly. After every single use, tools were cleaned of dirt and moisture. Blades were dried and oiled. Wooden handles were checked for cracks and treated with linseed oil to prevent drying and splitting. Sharp edges were kept sharp, not because it was satisfying, but because a dull blade means more effort, slower work, and a higher risk of injury. Everything was stored in dry, protected shelter before weather could reach it. Studies suggest that a properly maintained hand tool can remain fully functional for decades, sometimes generations. Poorly maintained tools fail within years. That's not a small difference in a context where replacing a broken tool might mean a season lost. Old farmers sharpened their tools in winter when the land rested. They repaired handles in the slow weeks between growing seasons. They understood that the care you give to your equipment in the quiet times determines what that equipment can do for you when everything is urgent. The habit of neglect, leaving things out, letting them rust, waiting until something breaks to think about fixing it, is a modern luxury. In a real survival context, it's a liability that compounds fast. 6. Depending on only one water source. Stop and think for a moment about how many things in your life depend on water coming out of a tap without interruption. Now ask yourself what happens the moment that tap stops. Old farmers never allowed themselves to be caught with a single answer to that question. A traditional farmstead almost always had multiple water systems operating simultaneously. A hand-dug well for drinking and cooking. Rainwater collection from roof surfaces running into cisterns or barrels for irrigation and washing. A nearby stream or pond as backup. In some regions, farmers carved swales and berms into the land specifically to direct and hold rainwater before it could run off the property. Research indicates that properties designed with passive water harvesting, shaped contours that slow and sink rainfall into the ground, can retain dramatically more water during storms than conventionally graded land, building a reservoir in the soil itself that plants can draw on during dry periods. This wasn't excess, it was redundancy. And redundancy in water is one of the oldest and most critical forms of survival preparation that exists. Today, most homes have one pipe coming in from one municipal source, one point of failure, one disruption away from a crisis. Old farmers looked at single points of failure the way a sailor looks at a boat with no backup oars, technically fine until it isn't. 5. Killing useful plants thinking they're weeds. Now we enter the part of this list that genuinely changes how some people see their own backyard, and this next one might be the most quietly urgent of all. Old farmers did not own lawns, they owned land, and they knew the difference. Every plant that pushed up through that land was evaluated, not instinctively ripped out but observed, identified, and considered. Because generations of farming knowledge had taught them something modern people have almost entirely lost. A huge number of the plants we now spray, poison, and mow are not weeds. They are food. They are medicine. They are indicators of what the soil beneath them is doing. Dandelion, despised, chemically annihilated across millions of American yards every spring, is one of the most nutritionally dense edible plants in the temperate world. Every part of it is edible. The leaves are rich in vitamins A, C, and K. The roots have been used for generations to support liver function. Studies suggest dandelion extracts demonstrate notable antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties in laboratory and clinical settings. Plantain, the broad-leafed plant that grows in almost every disturbed soil environment on Earth, was one of the most widely used wound and skin plants in traditional European and indigenous medicine. Research indicates it contains compounds with demonstrated antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory activity. Old farmers chewed it and pressed it directly onto stings, cuts, and infected areas. Stinging nettle, which most people avoid on contact, was a food crop, a fiber plant, a spring tonic, and a medicinal herb all in one. Studies suggest it contains exceptionally high levels of iron, calcium, and protein compared to most cultivated leafy greens. Old farmers read these plants the way we read labels. The land was a pharmacy, a grocery store, and a diagnostic tool all at once. We paved over it, poisoned it, and called that progress. 4. Not preserving food. We are 4 items from the most dangerous mistake on this list. And this next one is where old farmers showed a kind of genius that modern infrastructure has made nearly invisible. Before refrigerators, before freezers, before any of it, food had to be transformed to survive. Old farmers were masters of that transformation. They dried herbs and vegetables and fruits in the sun and open air, concentrating nutrients and extending shelf life from days to years. They smoked meats over specific hardwoods chosen for the flavor they imparted and the antimicrobial properties of the smoke itself. They fermented cabbage into sauerkraut, cucumbers into pickles, milk into cheese and kefir, grains into sourdough, each process creating not just preserved food but food that was more nutritious than when it started, rich with probiotic cultures that supported immune function and digestion. They built root cellars, structures half buried in earth where temperature and humidity stayed naturally stable, and used them to store root vegetables, cured meats, fermented crocks, and preserved jars for months at a time. Research indicates that many traditional preservation methods maintain or even enhance nutritional content compared to refrigerated fresh storage over time. Fermentation in particular has received significant scientific attention, with studies suggesting that the diverse microbial populations in traditionally fermented foods provide benefits far exceeding those of commercial probiotic supplements. The refrigerator is miraculous, but it requires electricity. It requires a functioning supply chain to fill it. The moment either of those things stops, a household with no preservation knowledge is in serious trouble, and most households today have exactly 0 of it. 3. Slaughtering animals at the wrong time. This one is barely even remembered, and losing it has cost more than most people realize. Old farmers knew that the timing of animal slaughter was not arbitrary. It was a decision calibrated to the animal's biology, the season's conditions, and the practical demands of food preservation, all at once. Animals slaughtered in late fall had spent the entire warmer season foraging and building fat reserves. That fat was at its peak, dense, stable, high in fat-soluble vitamins from months of pasture feeding. The cold of early winter meant the carcass could be worked and stored at safe temperatures without any refrigeration at all. Curing, smoking, and root cellar storage could begin immediately in conditions that naturally inhibited bacterial growth. Studies suggest that the fat composition of pasture-raised animals shifts significantly by season, with animals harvested in fall showing notably higher concentrations of omega-3 fatty acids and fat-soluble nutrients compared to those harvested in other seasons or raised in confinement year-round. Slaughter an animal at the wrong time in summer heat when the animal was lean, when flies were thick and temperatures made rapid spoilage almost inevitable, and you wasted most of what you worked to raise. Old farmers didn't just raise animals. They understood the full arc of the animal's life and aligned their decisions with it. That kind of biological literacy is almost completely gone now, replaced by processing facilities that operate on industrial schedules with no regard for season or animal condition. 2. Ignoring weather signs. One away from the most critical mistake on this entire list, but first this. Old farmers could read the sky the way you read a text message, not as a party trick but as a survival skill refined across generations of direct consequence. They watched cloud formations, how high they sat, how fast they moved, whether they built vertically or spread horizontally. They watched wind direction shifts through the day. They watched animal behavior with the attention of trained observers. When swallows flew low and fast, when cattle bunched tight and faced the same direction, when chickens refused the yard in the morning, when ants moved their eggs upward in the soil. Studies suggest that many animals can detect barometric pressure shifts, infrasound and atmospheric electromagnetic changes that fall entirely outside human sensory range, making them, in effect, biological weather instruments of extraordinary sensitivity. Birds reroute flight paths hours before a storm arrives. Bees return to the hive and seal it. Earthworms surface in mass before heavy rain as soil moisture and oxygen levels shift below ground. Old farmers cataloged these signals across lifetimes and passed them down. They weren't superstitions. They were pattern recognition operating at a level of local environmental literacy that satellite forecasting still can't replicate for hyperlocal conditions. Today, we check our phones, and when the phone is wrong, we're caught completely off guard because we've outsourced the reading entirely and forgotten how to do it ourselves. 1. Wasting wood and fire resources. Here it is, the mistake that ties every other one together, and the one that reveals exactly what separated farmers who survived from families that didn't. Old farmers cut their firewood in late spring and early summer, not because they were unusually disciplined, but because they understood something that most modern people have never had to learn. Wood that is cut green contains up to 50% water by weight. Burn it immediately and you get dense smoke, minimal heat, and a chimney coated in creosote that becomes a fire hazard by midwinter. Let it dry, season it properly in stacked, ventilated rows for 6 to 12 months, and that same wood burns clean, hot, and long. Research indicates that properly seasoned firewood delivers dramatically more usable heat per unit than green wood, with some studies estimating the difference in effective heat output at 40% or more for the same volume burned. But the lesson goes deeper than firewood. Old farmers thought in seasons, they thought in years. Every action taken in the warm months was an investment in the cold ones. Every moment of preparation in abundance was a direct act of protection against scarcity. They never waited until the need was urgent to begin addressing it, because by the time the need was urgent, it was already too late to prepare for it fully. They cut the wood before winter, they saved the seeds before the next planting, they preserved the food before the supply ran thin, they built the shelter before the storm arrived, they maintained the tools before the work became critical. This is the deepest survival principle that old farmers carried, and the one that has been most completely lost in modern life. We live in a culture that optimizes for immediate convenience and outsources preparation to supply chains, institutions, and systems we have no control over. Old farmers knew that everything those systems promised to provide, the land could give you directly, if you had the knowledge, the timing, and the patience to work with it. The wood doesn't cut itself, the seeds don't save themselves, the skills don't preserve themselves. But you can right now, starting today. If you made it this far, you already think differently than most people. Don't stop here, hit subscribe, we go deep on this knowledge every week. Drop your state in the comments, I want to see where this is reaching across the country. And here's a question for you, are you an old farmer or do you know one? If you have knowledge that belongs on this list, drop it in the comments right now. This list doesn't have to end at 11. The best wisdom in this community has always come from the people living it, and I want to hear yours. Share this with one person, that's how this knowledge spreads the same way it always did, person to person, hand to hand. Take care of the land, take care of your people, and never stop learning what the old ones knew.